Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, this is a place for stories that stay with you long after they end. If tonight's story moves you, consider following along for more. Now, let's begin. Wren Calloway packed her whole life into 2 duffel bags on a Tuesday morning, because that was how much room her stepfather's patience had left for her. 24 years old, and she stood on the porch of the only home she'd known since she was 6, listening to the deadbolt turn behind her. "You'll land on your feet," he said through the door, not unkindly, just tired of trying. Her mother had died 11 months earlier, and with her had gone the only reason Wren had a place in that house at all. She didn't cry on the porch. She'd promised herself that much. She walked to the bus stop with her bags cutting lines into her shoulders, and sat there until the 6 o'clock came, watching the sky go the color of a bruise. It was 3 weeks later, in a shared apartment above a laundromat, that the letter found her. It had been forwarded twice, the return address smudged, the paper thick and formal in a way nothing in her mailbox ever was. A law office in Hollow Creek, a town 4 hours north she'd never once visited. Inside was a single page informing Wren Calloway that she was the sole surviving heir of one Ada Marsh, and that she had inherited, in full, the property known locally as Marsh Mill. Wren read it twice before she understood the name meant nothing to her. Her mother had never mentioned a Marsh, never mentioned an Ada. When she called the number at the bottom of the letter, the lawyer's voice was careful, almost apologetic, the way people sound when they're handing you a gift they suspect is actually a burden. "Your grandmother," he said. "On your mother's side. I understand there was distance in the family." Distance. Wren turned the word over. Her mother had spoken of her own childhood exactly twice in Wren's whole life, both times briefly, both times followed by a silence that closed like a door. Now here was a woman Wren had never heard of, leaving her a building that had sat empty, according to the lawyer, for nearly 30 years. "Nobody's been inside?" Wren asked. "Not that anyone in town will admit to," he said. "The place has a reputation, but it's yours now, free and clear." She sat with the phone still warm in her hand, long after the call ended, looking around the cramped room she was renting week to week, and thought about the particular cruelty of being unwanted in one place while being handed, without warning, an entire building in another. She didn't know yet that the mill had been waiting for her specifically. She only knew she had nowhere else to go, and somewhere, 4 hours north, a door nobody had opened in 30 years was still shut. The bus dropped her at the edge of Hollow Creek, just as the afternoon light was turning gold and thin. Wren had expected a town, something with a center, a diner, a sign welcoming visitors. What she found was smaller than that. A scatter of houses along a 2-lane road, a gas station with one working pump, and beyond it all, up a gravel path lined with sumac gone wild, the mill itself. It was larger than she'd pictured. 3 stories of dark timber and stone, the old water wheel still clinging to its axle, though the creek beneath it had long since narrowed to a trickle. Windows stared out under 30 years of grime, and the roof lines sagged in the middle like something exhausted, holding itself up out of habit rather than strength. The lawyer had left a key with the gas station attendant, an older man named Harlan, who studied Wren for a long moment before handing it over. "You're the granddaughter," he said. "Not a question." "Word travels fast," Wren said. "Word never left," Harlan said. 30 years, and people still cross the street to walk past that place, instead of near it. He didn't explain further, and Wren didn't ask, too tired from the bus, and the letter, and the whole unraveling week, to absorb one more strange thing. She thanked him, and walked up the gravel path alone, the key heavy in her palm, gravel crunching under boots that weren't warm enough for the wind coming off the hills. The front door groaned when she pushed it open, releasing a breath of stale, mineral-smelling air that had been sealed in for longer than she'd been alive. Dust hung suspended in the shafts of light from the broken shutters, and everything inside sat exactly where it had been left. Chairs pushed back from a long table as if someone had simply stood up mid-meal and never returned. A shawl still hung over the back of one chair, moth-eaten now, the color impossible to guess. Wren moved slowly through the ground floor, past a stone hearth cold for 3 decades, past shelves of jars gone cloudy, past a wall of black and white photographs, so coated in dust she had to wipe each one with her sleeve to see the faces. None of them meant anything to her. Strangers in old-fashioned clothes, standing stiff before this same building when its wood was still pale and new. She found no photograph of her mother, no photograph of herself, obviously, but she'd half expected, foolishly, to feel some flicker of recognition somewhere in this house, some sign that she belonged to it. Instead, she felt like a trespasser in her own inheritance. At the back of the ground floor, past what had once been a kitchen, she found a door. Heavier than the others, iron-strapped, set into the stone foundation itself, rather than the wooden frame of the rest of the house. A padlock, rusted nearly solid, held it shut. Wren tried the handle anyway, out of instinct more than hope, and felt the door hold firm against decades of rust and stubbornness, as if whatever waited on the other side had no intention of being found so easily. Wren spent her first night in the mill wrapped in a blanket she'd found in a cedar chest upstairs, sitting at the long table with a candle stub for light, because the electricity had been cut off longer than she'd been alive. She hadn't planned to stay. She'd planned to see the place, maybe call a realtor in the morning, sell whatever this strange inheritance turned out to be worth. But something about sitting in that quiet, dust-thick room made leaving feel like abandoning a question she hadn't finished asking. In the morning, she walked back down to the gas station, and Harlan was there again, as if he hadn't moved. "Sleep all right?" he asked, in a tone that suggested he already knew the answer would be complicated. "There's a door in the back," Wren said. "Basement, maybe. Locked. Iron, not wood." Harlan's hands went still on the counter. "You didn't try to open it." "I tried. It didn't budge." He was quiet long enough that Wren thought he might not answer at all. Then he set down the rag he'd been holding and said, "Eleanor sealed that door herself. Hired a man from 2 towns over to do it, because nobody local would touch the job. That was the same summer she stopped coming into town for supplies. Same summer she stopped coming out of that mill at all, if the stories are true." "What stories?" "That there was an accident. That something happened to your grandmother's husband down there. And whatever it was, she never spoke of it, never let anyone near that door again. And eventually she just closed up the whole house and lived like a ghost until she died in the upstairs bedroom, alone, with nobody but the postman knowing she was still breathing." Wren felt something cold move through her. Not quite fear, closer to the sensation of standing at the edge of a hole in the dark and realizing it went down further than she'd guessed. "You said her husband." "My grandfather. Nobody around here ever called him that," Harlan said carefully. "Nobody around here ever called him anything, far as I remember. He came, and then he was gone, and Eleanor never spoke his name again that anyone heard." Wren walked back up the gravel path with the wind pulling at her coat, turning Harlan's words over the way she'd turned over the word distance days earlier, feeling the shape of a family history that had been kept from her not by accident, but by design. Whatever her mother had run from all those years ago, whatever had made her erase this entire town and this entire mill and this entire grandmother from every conversation she'd ever had with her daughter, it was down there behind that iron door, and Wren found herself standing before it again by nightfall, the padlock cold under her fingers, thinking that some inheritances weren't measured in property at all, but in the right to finally ask what had been buried, and why. Wren didn't sleep that second night either. She sat with the candle burning low, thinking about iron doors and unnamed men, and a grandmother who'd walled herself into silence, and by the time the sky outside the shutters turned pale gray, she'd made up her mind. She found a hammer and a pry bar in the tool shed behind the mill, both rusted but usable, and she worked at the padlock until her palms blistered and the old metal finally gave way with a crack that echoed through the empty house like a gunshot. The door itself resisted longer, swollen shut by 30 years of damp, but it opened at last with a groan that seemed to come from the whole building, rather than the hinges alone. Cold air rose to meet her, carrying the smell of stone and standing water and something else underneath, something like old paper. Wren lit a second candle and went down. The basement was smaller than she'd expected, a single room carved into the foundation, and what she found there wasn't what 30 years of town whispers had prepared her for. There was no accident, no violence frozen in place. Instead, along one wall stood shelves of carefully preserved boxes, and in the center of the room, a writing desk with a chair pulled up to it, as if someone had sat there recently rather than decades ago. On the desk, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the damp, was a stack of letters tied with string, and beneath them, a leather journal with Eleanor's name written inside the cover in careful looping script. Wren sat in the dust and cold and began to read, and the story that emerged was nothing like the one Harlan had implied. There had been no husband who vanished under suspicious circumstances. There had been a man, yes, someone Eleanor had loved and married quietly, away from the judgment of a town that hadn't accepted him, because he'd come from a family the community considered beneath the Whitfields, a mill hand's son with no land and no name worth mentioning at church suppers. When Eleanor's own father discovered the marriage, he'd forced a choice, the man or the mill. And Eleanor, young and frightened and not yet strong enough to be the woman she'd later become, had let her father buy the man off and send him away. She never saw him again. The letters were his, dozens of them, sent over years, each one returned unopened by her father, before Eleanor ever knew they'd arrived, until decades later, after her father's death, when she found them hidden in his own study, still sealed, still waiting. By then it was too late to find him. All Eleanor could do was seal herself into the one room where she could keep them close, reading and rereading a life she'd let slip through her fingers out of fear, until fear became habit, and habit became the whole shape of her remaining years. Wren sat with the journal open on her lap, candle guttering, and felt something shift inside her chest that had nothing to do with mystery solved and everything to do with recognition. This wasn't a stranger's tragedy. It was the first thread of an answer to a question she hadn't known to ask, the reason her mother had run from this house and never looked back, and Wren understood, with a certainty that settled into her bones, that the story wasn't finished yet. Because somewhere in these boxes was the reason her own mother's name never once appeared in this basement of careful, hoarded grief. Wren spent 3 days in that basement, reading by candlelight, and then, once she'd restrung wire to a single working outlet, by the bare glow of a hanging bulb. The journal covered decades, Eleanor's handwriting changing as the years passed, growing smaller and more cramped, as if she were trying to fit a whole unlived life into the margins of the one she'd actually had. It was in the later entries, the ones written in a hand gone shaky with age, that Wren found her mother's name. Eleanor had a daughter, not with the man from the letters, but with a second husband, someone Eleanor described in the journal with a coldness that made Wren's stomach tighten. A marriage entered into out of loneliness and family pressure rather than love. The kind of arrangement that produces a household, but not a home. The daughter's name was Catherine, and reading it, Wren felt the ground shift under her, because Catherine Whitfield was, impossibly, her own mother's name before she'd married. Wren had never once heard her mother called Catherine Whitfield. She'd only ever been Kathy Voss, a woman who'd built her whole adult identity around the name of the man she married, and, Later, the man she didn't. According to the journal, Catherine had grown up in this mill under Eleanor's particular grief, raised by a mother who was present in body but absent everywhere else, spending her evenings with letters from a man who wasn't Catherine's father, treating her own daughter as an afterthought to a love story that had ended before Catherine was ever born. The entries grew sparser as Catherine got older, until one, dated the year Wren herself would later calculate as her mother's 19th birthday, simply read, "Catherine left this morning." Did not say where, did not say why. I understand, though I wish she had let me explain. Perhaps there was nothing to explain that would have mattered to her. I raised a daughter in the shadow of a grief that was never hers to carry, and now she has gone to build something of her own, away from all of it, away from me. I do not blame her. I only hope, someday, she finds a way to let someone love her without also asking them to disappear. Wren read that final line 4 times, feeling it settle into places she hadn't realized were tender. Her mother had never let anyone get close. Not really. Not even Wren. Not in the unguarded way children need. She'd loved her fiercely but carefully, always a little apart, always keeping some door of her own shut tight. Wren had spent years quietly resenting that distance, without ever understanding it had a history, a whole architecture of inherited grief, passed down like a family heirloom nobody had chosen to keep. Beneath the journal, in the last box on the shelf, Wren found something else. A small bundle of drawings, a child's crayon renderings of the mill and the creek and a woman who could only be Eleanor. And on the back of one, in a child's careful print, the words for Mama, "So you remember I was here." Wren sat with that drawing for a long time, understanding finally that the silence in her own house growing up hadn't been about her at all. It had been Catherine's inheritance, passed down the only way grief knows how to pass, quietly and without asking permission. Wren stayed in Hollow Creek. She told herself at first it was only to sort the estate, to decide what to keep and what to sell. But the weeks stretched into a season, and somewhere in that stretch, staying stopped needing a reason. She cleaned the mill room by room, not erasing its history but making peace with it, airing out the shawl instead of throwing it away, oiling the hinges of the iron door instead of sealing it shut again, because some doors, she'd decided, were meant to stay openable even if you didn't walk through them every day. Harlan came by more often than the errand of buying supplies required, and slowly the town's whispered reputation for the mill softened into something closer to curiosity, then eventually something like welcome. Wren framed the child's drawing and hung it by the front door, the first thing anyone would see walking in, a reminder that this house had once held love as well as loss, and that the two had simply gotten tangled somewhere along the way. She wrote a letter of her own, though she had no address to send it to, no living person to receive it. She wrote it to her mother instead, the woman who'd raised her with careful, guarded love, who'd died without ever explaining the shape of her own childhood. And in writing it, Wren found she wasn't angry anymore. Not at Catherine for the silences, not at Eleanor for the grief that made those silences necessary, not even at the nameless great-grandfather who'd started the whole quiet catastrophe by choosing pride over his daughter's happiness. She understood, finally, that people didn't fail each other out of cruelty nearly as often as they failed each other out of fear, out of never having been shown another way to love. If you've ever inherited more from your family than you expected, not property, but patterns, silences, the particular way someone taught you to keep people at arm's length without ever meaning to, let us know in the comments, because Wren wasn't the only one carrying something like that, and she wouldn't be the last to set it down. By late autumn, the mill's water wheel turned again, repaired by Harlan's nephew as a housewarming gift Wren hadn't asked for and hadn't known how to refuse. She stood at the creek's edge one evening, watching it move, slow and steady, and thought about how strange it was that the place which had once seemed like a punishment, an inheritance from a stranger, a burden dropped on her at the worst possible moment, had become the first place in her adult life that felt entirely, unambiguously hers. Not because a lawyer's letter had said so, because she'd walked into the dark of it and stayed long enough to understand what she was standing in. Thank you for spending this story with us tonight. If Ren's journey found its way into your heart, follow the channel, and we'll see you again soon for another story worth staying for.